I set up our business with my wife Beth 10 years ago after we studied architecture in Scotland. We soon realized to work in Nairobi, we had to develop a very different form of practice to our more conventional training as architects. Why? We were faced and confronted with a lack of resources, craftsmanship, tools, and when you compound that with the crippling traffic and the power cuts and the hassle from city council and all the problems we face, Nairobi can seem like an impossible place to get anything made. How can you take this situation of lack and turn it into an opportunity? And for us, the big question is, how do you take this gap from design to built form and negotiate it in a way that's different, in a way that builds systems that allow us to use whatever levels of craftsmanship and whatever materials we have available to us? I mean, these are big questions that you don't answer and can't answer overnight. So to make sense of things and really just get moving, we set up our own workshop in Nairobi's industrial area. By all accounts, a horrible, grim place to go to every day. No pavement, open sewage, extremely polluted. But you know what? It's the heart of Kenya's manufacturing. And it was a very deliberate decision to place ourselves here because behind these blank walls lies this incredible world of manufacturing and industry. So, and I'll show you how we tap into that. This is our workshop. Now, the really exciting thing about learning new skills is that you start to think through these new materials that you're working with. And, you slowly get a feel of what you're doing, and we increasingly rely on more and more what we can source locally rather than what's imported. In using what we can find, we slowly learn how to coax these humble materials into something well-made and beautiful, starting with furniture and increasingly bits of building and, building made like we make furniture, or with the same care that we make furniture. Our workshop has become a really essential part of our studio space. Not only does it give us a lot of pleasure, it really helps us understand how things are made. And as a result, we increasingly find ourselves operating in a space that lies between the trades and professions. And for us in Kenya, this is how we can bring a value to the profession as a whole. So we use our workshop to make models like architects would, but we also use it to make jigs and templates to find a model way of working with people we work with. Getting involved at every stage is not easy. And we're learning that this way of working requires a degree of care in material sourcing and manufacturing that's not normal for most architects. So we start with ourselves, we design for others to make, and we make with others. And that's where we learn design tolerance. With this in mind, I'll take you through a project we're working on at the moment. This is for a cathedral in the west of Kenya. It's a new build cathedral. All the pieces are of one family, so but they're all very different in the way they've come together. So there's a stacking chair that's for the celebrants on the up front, and that's something we're making ourselves. The pews were designed for someone else to make, and the doors to be made in collaboration with others. There are other bits and pieces as well, but I won't talk about them today. This project has been really important for us. One, it's a great privilege to be asked to work on a cathedral, and it's a really important space. But for us, it's brought to the fore all the challenges we face and encapsulates trying to make a high-end product in a very difficult context. So, let's start with ourselves in the chairs. We started off with the pews as our starting point, and the form of the chair resolved itself very quickly. This was the really easy bit. Client was happy, right, you're going to make it. And we started to scratch our heads. Oh my God, how are we going to make this damn thing? I mean, the two big challenges we faced here were, one was sourcing enough timber in Kenya to actually do the job. We've cut all our trees down. And two, it was quite a personal thing, was trying to work out how to make the chair back with our tools, our skills, and materials available to us. And that was an exciting challenge in the way it could really push our skills and technique. Cypress is one of the only sustainable timbers available to us in Kenya. People have a very negative preconception about it, as it's generally very badly machined. However, with a bit of care, this wood, which is usually grown for the construction industry, can be made into something really beautiful. And so this whole sourcing of timber had to happen in parallel to the design process, because you've got to buy it, stack it, dry it, because you can't just go and buy dry timber. So that was a whole process that had to happen, and for the pews included. And you could only do that by actually having worked with it as a material and understanding what the waste comes out of it, what you can machine. And you can see the pieces are actually very bowed and of not very good quality on one level, but you still have to work with it and learn what you can get out of it and how it behaves. We found a supplier amazingly close to the site, and it was actually a tea factory that grows this wood to make charcoal for their drying sheds. So there was an amazing opportunity here where, and I think a beautiful alchemy, where this undervalued timber comes to Nairobi, gets transformed into something beautiful, and then goes back to site as a valuable product. We started off by experimenting different ways of making the back. So we had a handrail type, which, much like the making of a banister rail, was really clumsy to and complicated to machine and assemble and difficult to put together. And had to be very chunky to make a good joint. And then there was a laminated form, which which would have been a more typical solution. But after 8-9 months of trying to source veneer, even though plywood is made locally, we just couldn't get hold of it. So we used a version called Kerf Cutting, which involves cutting little slots in wood, allowing it to bend. And if you put a skin of veneer on the inside and outside, it would strengthen it. So quite a scary process, but we managed to cut our own veneer in the end to do this. And that's how it went. And the nice thing then about how we resolved the back was, this is the design evolution then of the chair, is that making it much more slender as a back piece allowed us to taper the back leg into the slender back and gave us much more space around the shoulder. So here is a video of the chair backs in production. I'll just come on to it, showing how we had to make our own jigs, our templates, cut our own veneer, and in this case we even had to make our own clamps because we couldn't buy clamps. So there's a combination of machining by hand and machining and handiwork. So the two combined to make the piece. you go. And then that's the finished piece. And you can see how the wedges really express how we resolve the form. Well, moving on to how we design for others to make, the pews, in order to sit a congregation of 1,000 people in quite an unusual plan-shaped building, we had to come up with a design that was really easy to replicate by someone else and was really sympathetic to the constraints of the timber and the production capabilities of the person who's going to make it. So we started by making lots of plywood versions, always working at 1:1 to test the proportions at the scale of the human body. I mean, the pew is an amazing double-sided bench where you've got someone kneeling and someone sitting, and there's this beautiful separation between them, and it's how to negotiate that space. So that's how the kind of evolution happened. On the one hand, the form of the building influenced the form of the pews, where there's a repetition of arches in the building that's picked up in the fins, and the cantilevers in the building echo how the seat and the elbow rest present themselves. And then on the other, details affect the overall layout of the plan of the building. So reducing the space between the pews by just 20 millimeters meant you could get an extra 20 people in the 20 more people in the building. But in both cases, resolving of the idea at the scale of, it's about resolving the scale of the building at the scale of the individual. So you can see how pieces come out of stock in a sensible way. It was all quite, components repeat themselves, and we made a lot of detailing that made it really easy to glue up with shadow gaps and offsets, and that made it really easy to assemble without looking, well, it still had a richness about it, which we liked. And the idea was that the piece could be prefabricated in Nairobi and then assembled on site, because if it transported to site as a finished piece, it would all rattle itself apart on the road. And the level of care necessary for us extended to not only working out cutting lists for the manufacturer, but also sorting out all the ironmongery and making it. And you know, usually one would assume that a manufacturer would sort all this out for you, but that's not how it works in our context. We had to get very involved in the process and sort it out for him. And we test all the ideas, then making prototypes in the workshop, using the jigs and templates that we would, and drawings that we would give someone else to make sure that it all works. But of course, give it to the manufacturer and it all changes. He just kind of, you know, like, he had a very different approach to how he wanted to drill holes, for example. He was trying to drill all the holes using a router rather than a drill. But this is where we have to kind of accommodate. And we made jigs. He made his own jigs to allow himself to plunge his router. Crazy, but that's what he did, and we have to work with that. And that's a negotiation. So that's how the conversation evolves as we go through some of the basic processes. And then finally, the pieces were assembled on site, largely to our satisfaction. These are doors we're working on, and it's really, it's a very different, these are the front doors of the cathedral, steel and bronze, and it's a very different project for all of us involved. The client had commissioned the bronze panels, and we inherited vestiges of a timber door that they were meant to go in, but we then resolved it by proposing a steel door on a pivot hinge, because timber wasn't appropriate to make the frame, because it was not cypress isn't long enough or strong enough. The drawing shows a dissection of all the parts, and this is where, you know, it's about understanding our tolerances in working in metal, how the hinge had to fit, because the hinge was something that was pre-bought, and that had to work in that we had to fit a very precisely made door in a very wonky opening, and I'll get on to that. And then we had to work out how the bronze panels fit into our door as well. I mean, that shows that there are a whole lot of processes that are very local. So all the material for the door is locally manufactured, and all the processes happen locally, all basically in about a 5-kilometer radius around our workshop. And so we first start off by exploring what we can and what we can't make ourselves. You know, how big are these doors really? How does a weld show? Can we leave the steel raw? You know, could we actually make these doors without getting a grinder to the piece? I mean, this is a challenge, and you can't go and ask someone these questions. You have to experiment well before you go near a computer and try and draw it. The pivot hinge is beautifully made, and in itself can't solve the problem of hinging the door. So as a result, we had to hack it, and we had to make a whole series of jigs and plates to allow this tolerance of fit and adjustment. And this is a negotiation between us and the contractor to allow this piece to fit. A similar level of care goes in the artwork, so the artist makes, and this is the process of lost wax casting that's happening in the workshop as well. So the artist is making these clay panels, working them up, and then she makes her silicon and plaster casts, and then it goes to the bronze foundry where they make waxes, and then they get encased in this silicate mold, which is then melted, makes a mold to cast the bronze, and the panels then are welded together and assembled in different jigs. Point is, okay, that's the prototype. I'm going to start making the doors next week when I get back. But look, there's nothing new, really, in the way we work now. I mean, architects were always design builders, but there's a process there that's been forgotten in our world of specialization and industrialization. However, the most important change we notice in our own work is that we become a bit more tolerant, in the way we absorb different ways of making into our design thinking. And this is how we've learned how to take a deficit and turn it into an opportunity. We've learned to bridge a distance between the perfectly machined goods and less perfect handcrafted ones, and tap into an economy that allows the two to coexist. And that's provided us a real opportunity to make new designs that are more socially engaged. We even embrace imperfection, and in some ways demand it from others, because, it's actually very beautiful, and not just something that's only good enough for Africa. Thank you.